It was just another quiet autumn afternoon in Central Park, New York City. Leaves rustled across the pavement like whispers from another world, and the crisp air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. For most people, it was just another day. But for 24-year-old Ethan Brooks, a freelance photographer barely scraping by, it would be the day that would forever change his life, though he had no idea then. Ethan had a habit of wandering through the park after his failed job hunts or rejected pitches. The bench near the duck pond had unintentionally become his therapist's couch. That afternoon, slumped with his camera resting on his lap and his hope dangling by a thread, Ethan noticed an elderly man sitting on the far end of the bench. The man's face was sunken, his suit too large for his fragile frame, and his eyes, those eyes, were drenched in sorrow. Ethan, not usually one to start conversations, felt a strange pull. Maybe it was the way the man clutched an old photograph in his trembling hands. Maybe it was because Ethan had no one to talk to either. Or maybe, just maybe, kindness sometimes rises uninvited from the ashes of our own despair. He scooted over a little and gently asked, "You okay, sir?" The old man didn't reply at first. He just looked up, startled, then gave the faintest smile. "People don't usually ask that anymore," he murmured. "I guess we all need someone to ask," Ethan said quietly. And just like that, something cracked open, in both of them. His name was Mr. Harold Whitmore. Once a successful architect, he now lived alone in a mansion that had become a prison of silence. He had outlived his wife, his son, and most of his friends. The photograph he held was of his late son, who had died young in a car crash. "I come here every Thursday," he said, voice quivering, "because this is where we used to sit, me and Henry." He loved the ducks. Ethan didn't speak. He just listened. For over 2 hours. That single conversation turned into a routine. Every Thursday, Ethan would find Harold sitting there, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, and each time, he'd sit with him. Sometimes they'd talk about Harold's life, architecture, regrets. Other times, they just sat in silence and fed the ducks. Ethan rarely spoke of his own struggles, but Harold saw through him. He'd occasionally drop quiet words of wisdom, "Keep going. Not for what you gain, but for who you become." One day, Harold wasn't there. Nor the next Thursday. Ethan waited for weeks, but the bench remained empty. He asked the park staff, but no one knew what had happened to the old man. Eventually, life moved on. Ethan got a steady photography job with a small magazine. Years passed. He married a fellow artist, had a child, and left that chapter of his life in the park's memory. But sometimes, while playing with his daughter, he'd glance at an old photo on his desk. A candid shot of Harold feeding ducks, and feel something stir inside. 7 years later, on a rainy Tuesday morning, Ethan heard a knock on his apartment door. Standing there was a sharply dressed man holding a leather folder. "Mr. Ethan Brooks?" "Yes. My name is Charles Denton. I'm an attorney. May I come in?" Confused and a little wary, Ethan stepped aside. Charles sat down and opened the folder. "I represent the estate of the late Mr. Harold Whitmore." Ethan's heart skipped. "Harold, he passed away?" "Yes. 6 years ago, shortly after your last meeting. He had been battling a terminal illness. He chose not to tell you." Ethan's throat tightened. "I didn't know. No one did. But he knew his time was coming. And he made specific arrangements." Charles slid a sealed envelope across the table. "He left this for you. And, a few more things." With shaking hands, Ethan opened the letter. It read, "Dear Ethan, you may not realize what your companionship meant to me, but I need you to know, you saved me. Those Thursdays were my reason to hold on. In a world that had forgotten me, you sat down. You listened. You reminded me that I still mattered. I watched you, too, your quiet strength, your persistence even when things were tough. You reminded me of my son in many ways. That bench became sacred to me, not because of the past, but because of you. You gave without asking. So allow me now to do the same. Take what I've left behind, not as payment, but as a promise. Use it to live freely. Use it to become forever grateful. Harold ***. Tears blurred Ethan's vision. He looked up as the lawyer placed another document before him, the will. Harold had left him his entire estate. The house. His savings. Investments. Everything. It was worth over $4.8 million. Ethan sat in stunned silence. Charles explained that Harold had no remaining family. He believed you were the closest thing he had to a son, he said gently. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, holding his daughter in his arms, trying to understand how a few hours on a bench had led to this. But deep down, he knew the truth: it wasn't about the money. It was about the meaning. Ethan and his wife used part of the inheritance to start a non-profit foundation, the Bench Project, which focused on connecting lonely elderly individuals with young volunteers through weekly meetups in parks across the country. A simple act of sitting down, listening, and showing up, just like he had with Harold. Each bench sponsored had a small plaque that read, "Kindness doesn't always change the world in an instant. But it changes a life, and sometimes, that's the same thing." Years later, Ethan would bring his daughter to the same spot in Central Park. She'd ask, "Daddy, who's that man in the picture on the bench?" He'd smile and reply, "That, my love, is Mr. Harold Whitmore." He reminded me that sometimes, the simplest moments are the ones that define our entire lives. And in the quiet, with ducks gliding across the water and autumn leaves dancing in the wind, Ethan would sit again, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Because he had learned a truth far more valuable than any inheritance. That a few kind words on a park bench can echo across a lifetime, and beyond.